the first time Preston Adams laid eyes on Tabitha Moore. She was standing in the dusty street outside the general store in Abilene, Kansas, clutching a carpetbag that had seen better days and wearing a dress that hung loose on her thin frame. It was the summer of 1879, and the scorching July heat made waves rise from the packed earth of Texas Street. What caught his attention was not her appearance, but rather the way Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, had deliberately crossed to the other side of the road to avoid passing near her. Preston had been leaning against the hitching post, his horse drinking from the trough, when he noticed the way the townsfolk seemed to part around this woman like she carried some contagious disease. She could not have been more than 22 or 23 years old, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty if it were not so pinched with hunger and what looked like defeat. Her eyes, though, those were what made him look twice. They were a startling green, and they held a fierce determination that contrasted sharply with her bedraggled appearance. He watched as she approached old Mr. Patterson, who owned the feed store, and spoke to him quietly. Even from this distance, Preston could see the old man shake his head firmly before turning his back on her. The woman's shoulders sagged just slightly before she straightened them again and moved on to the next establishment. Preston had come into town for supplies and to post an advertisement for a housekeeper. His ranch, the AA, sat about 5 miles outside of Abilene, and since his mother had passed away the previous winter, the house had fallen into a state of disrepair that embarrassed him. At 28 years old, he had been managing the ranch on his own for 3 years since his father's death, and he was good at cattle and horses. Cooking and cleaning, however, were skills that eluded him entirely. He had already posted his notice at the general store, offering fair wages and room and board for someone willing to keep house for a bachelor rancher. Several women had expressed interest, but they were all either too young and would cause talk, or too old and infirm to manage the work. He needed someone capable, someone who would not expect anything beyond honest work and honest pay. As he watched the mysterious woman make her way down the street, being rejected at each stop, curiosity got the better of him. He pushed off from the hitching post and crossed the street, intercepting her just as she emerged from the seamstress shop, her face flushed with what might have been humiliation. "Pardon me, miss," he said, removing his hat. "I could not help but notice you seemed to be looking for work." She stopped and looked up at him with those startling green eyes. Up close, he could see the fine bone structure of her face, the way her lips were chapped from the sun, and the wariness that clouded her expression. "I am," she said quietly. Her voice was educated, he noticed. Not the rough drawl of most women who drifted through Kansas looking for work. "Though I am beginning to think this town has no use for me." "Might I ask why that is?" Preston asked. "You seem able-bodied enough." A bitter smile crossed her face. "I am able-bodied, sir, but I am also a widow of questionable reputation. My husband died 6 months ago in Dodge City, and certain people there decided that I must have had something to do with it, despite the doctor declaring it pneumonia. The rumors followed me here, and it seems Mrs. Henderson has made it her mission to ensure everyone knows I am not to be trusted." Preston glanced back at the general store, where his advertisement still hung in the window. He thought about his cold meals and dusty floors, about the cobwebs gathering in corners and the pile of mending that sat untouched in a basket. He thought about the loneliness of the ranch house and how it seemed to echo with emptiness these days. "Can you cook?" he asked bluntly. She blinked at him in surprise. "Yes, sir. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage a household. I did so for my late husband for 3 years. Can you handle hard work? My ranch is not a small operation and the house has been neglected for some time." I am not afraid of hard work, she said, lifting her chin. I am afraid of starving, which is what will happen if I cannot find employment soon. Preston made a decision that he would later reflect upon as either the best or the most foolish of his life. I am Preston Adams. I run the Double-A Ranch about 5 miles from here. I need a housekeeper, someone who can cook and clean and keep the place from falling down around my ears. The pay is $20 a month, plus room and board. You would have your own room, and I expect nothing but honest work. I keep to myself mostly, and I would expect you to do the same. Are you interested? The transformation in her face was immediate. Hope flared in those green eyes, quickly followed by suspicion. You would hire me, just like that, without caring what anyone else says. I care about whether you can do the work, Preston said. The rest is none of my business. Though I will tell you straight, if you are planning any mischief, I sleep with my door locked and my gun handy. I am offering you honest work, and I expect honest labor in return. I want nothing more than that, she said firmly. I am Tabitha Moore, and I give you my word that I will work harder than any housekeeper you have ever had. Fair enough, Preston said. He gestured toward his horse. I have a wagon over at the livery. If you are ready now, we can head out to the ranch. I am ready, Tabitha said, clutching her carpetbag tighter. I have everything I own right here. As they walked toward the livery, Preston could feel the eyes of the town on them. He heard the whispers starting up, saw the curtains twitching in windows. Mrs. Henderson stood outside the general store with 2 of her friends, their faces pinched with disapproval. Preston ignored them all. He had never been one to care much about gossip, and he was not about to start now. The ride out to the ranch was quiet at first. Tabitha sat stiffly on the wagon seat beside him, her carpetbag clutched on her lap, her eyes taking in the rolling prairie that stretched out on either side of the rutted road. The grassland was brown from the summer heat, but Preston knew that come autumn it would green up again with the cooler weather. His cattle were scattered across the range, red and white shapes against the golden grass. How long have you had the ranch? Tabitha asked finally, breaking the silence. My father started it 20 years ago, Preston said, keeping his eyes on the road. He built it from nothing, ran it until he died 3 years back. My mother stayed on to help me until last winter. Pneumonia took her. I am sorry, Tabitha said softly. It must have been hard losing both of them. It was, Preston said simply. He was not one for elaborate emotions, but the loss still ached in quiet moments. They were good people, worked hard their whole lives. This ranch was their dream. And now it is yours, Tabitha observed. I suppose it is, Preston said, though there are days I wonder if I am doing right by their memory. The ranch runs well enough, but the house. He trailed off, shaking his head. I will take care of the house, Tabitha said firmly. You have my word on that. When they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Preston watched Tabitha's face for her reaction. The house was a 2-story structure built of good timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. His father had built it to last, and it showed in the solid construction. But the porch needed sweeping, the windows were grimy, and the whole place had an air of neglect that embarrassed Preston. The barn and outbuildings were in better shape, since Preston spent most of his time with the animals. His horses lifted their heads from the corral as the wagon approached, and a few chickens scattered across the yard, evidence of his half-hearted attempts at keeping poultry. It is a good house, Tabitha said, and Preston heard genuine appreciation in her voice. Good bones. It just needs some care. That is what my mother used to say, Preston said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the porch. He climbed down and offered Tabitha his hand to help her descend. She took it briefly, her fingers thin and rough with work, then quickly released it once her feet touched the ground. Preston led her inside, opening the door to reveal the front room. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through the dirty windows. The furniture was good quality but covered in a fine layer of dust. A stack of newspapers sat haphazardly on the table, and his dirty dishes from breakfast still sat on the counter in the kitchen visible through the doorway. "I am not much for housekeeping," Preston said, stating the obvious. Tabitha walked through the room slowly, her eyes taking in everything. Preston followed, seeing his home through her eyes and feeling increasingly embarrassed. The kitchen was the worst, with pots that needed scrubbing and a stove that had not been properly cleaned in months. Upstairs, the bedrooms were in slightly better shape, mostly because he only used one of them. "This will be your room," Preston said, opening the door to the room that had been his mother's. It faced east, catching the morning sun, and still had her furniture: a bed with a good mattress, a dresser, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher. "It has not been touched since she passed. I could not bring myself to disturb it." Tabitha stepped inside and ran her hand gently over the dresser top. "It is lovely," she said softly. "Are you certain you want me to use it?" "My mother would have wanted it used," Preston said. "She never liked things to sit idle." "Then I will take good care of it," Tabitha promised. Preston showed her the rest of the upstairs, pointing out his own room at the end of the hall and the spare room that he used for storage. Back downstairs, he walked her through the kitchen, the pantry, the washroom, and the cellar where his meager supplies of preserved foods were stored. "I usually eat in town when I go in for supplies," Preston admitted. "Or I make do with beans and biscuits. I am not much of a cook." Tabitha opened the pantry and examined the contents with a critical eye. "You have flour, salt, some lard, beans, rice, a bit of coffee." She turned to him. "Do you have a garden?" Preston felt his face heat. "There used to be one. My mother kept it, but it has gone to weeds now. Chickens?" "A few. They mostly roam wild, but they lay eggs if you can find where they hide them." Tabitha nodded slowly, her mind clearly working through possibilities. "I can work with this. When do you next go to town for supplies?" "I was planning to go tomorrow," Preston said. "Then I will make a list of what we need," Tabitha said. She turned to face him squarely. "Mr. Adams, I want to make something clear. You have given me an opportunity when no one else would. I intend to prove that your faith was not misplaced. I will work hard, and I will make this house a proper home again, but I need to know your expectations." Preston respected her directness. "My expectations are simple," he said. "Keep the house clean, cook meals, do the washing and mending. I work the ranch from sunup to sundown most days. I will take my breakfast early around 5:30, dinner at noon when I come in from the range, supper around 7 in the evening. Beyond that, your time is your own as long as the work gets done." "That is fair," Tabitha said. "And my room and board are included in addition to the $20 monthly." "Yes. I am not much for conversation, and I expect you are not either, given what you have been through. We will work together, keep to ourselves, and get along fine." "I think we will," Tabitha agreed. "I will leave you to settle in," Preston said. "There is water in the pump out back. The outhouse is behind the barn. I have some work to finish in the barn before supper. Take your time getting familiar with the place." He left her there in the kitchen, her carpetbag still clutched in her hand, and headed out to the barn. He had fences to mend and horses to check, but his mind was distracted by the strange turn his day had taken. He had gone into town looking for a housekeeper, and had come back with a woman the whole town had shunned. He hoped he had not made a terrible mistake. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Preston finally made his way back to the house, dirty from work and hungry enough to eat his own boots. As he approached the porch, he caught a scent that made him stop in his tracks. Something was cooking, and it smelled better than anything he had smelled in months. He washed up at the pump, scrubbing the worst of the dirt from his hands and face, then made his way inside. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The front room had been swept, the dust cleared from the surfaces. The windows, while not yet washed, had been opened to let in fresh air. He could hear sounds from the kitchen and followed them like a man in a trance. Tabitha stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up and a faded apron tied around her waist. The kitchen, while far from pristine, looked better than it had in months. The dishes had been washed and put away, the counter scrubbed clean. On the stove, a pot bubbled with something that smelled of heaven. "I hope you do not mind," Tabitha said, glancing up at him. "I found some potatoes in the cellar and some salt pork in the pantry. I made a stew with some of the vegetables I found in the garden." The carrots and onions had gone wild, but they were still good. Preston realized he was staring and forced himself to speak. "I do not mind at all. That smells incredible." A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. It transformed her features, making her look younger and lighting up those green eyes. "I have not had a proper kitchen to work in for months. This is a pleasure." She ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed them on the table, which she had already set with utensils and cups. She had found the bread Preston had bought in town 3 days ago, stale now but edible, and sliced it onto a plate. Preston sat down at his own table and stared at the meal before him. The stew was thick with vegetables and chunks of meat, the broth rich and steaming. He picked up his spoon and took a bite, and in that moment, every rule he had set for himself about keeping distance and staying professional flew straight out of his head. The stew was not just good. It was extraordinary. The flavors were perfectly balanced, the vegetables cooked just right, the meat tender. It was the kind of meal his mother used to make, the kind of meal that made a house feel like a home. He looked up at Tabitha, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and anxiety in her eyes. "This is the best thing I have eaten in a year," he said honestly. "Maybe longer." The relief that flooded her face was palpable. "Truly, truly," Preston confirmed, taking another bite. "If you can cook like this, I do not care what anyone in Abilene says about you. You can stay as long as you want." Tabitha's eyes grew suspiciously bright, and she blinked rapidly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You do not know what that means to me." They ate in companionable silence, Preston finishing 2 bowls of stew and 3 slices of bread. When he finally pushed back from the table, more satisfied than he had been in months, he found himself looking at Tabitha with new eyes. She was not just a desperate woman who needed work. She was someone with real skill, someone who took pride in what she did. "I will clean up," Tabitha said, rising to gather the dishes. "Let me help," Preston said, surprising himself. "There is no need," Tabitha protested. "This is my job. My mother always said cooking and cleaning up was easier when shared," Preston said, carrying his bowl to the washbasin. "Besides, you have already done more work today than I had any right to expect." They washed the dishes together, Tabitha washing and Preston drying. It felt strange and intimate, working side by side like this, but also comfortable in a way Preston had not expected. When they finished, Tabitha excused herself to retire to her room, claiming exhaustion from the day's events. Preston sat on the porch as the last light faded from the sky, smoking his pipe and thinking about the woman now sleeping under his roof. He had hired her out of pragmatism and perhaps a bit of stubbornness, not wanting to let town gossip dictate his decisions. But that meal had changed something. It had reminded him of what he had been missing. Not just good food, but the sense of someone caring about the small details that made life pleasant. He finished his pipe and headed inside, locking up the house for the night. As he climbed the stairs to his room, he noticed light coming from under Tabitha's door. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she was as surprised by the success of this strange arrangement as he was. The next morning, Preston woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs to find Tabitha already in the kitchen, her hair neatly pinned back, her dress clean if worn. She had found his mother's aprons and wore one over her dress. The kitchen table was set for two, and a platter of bacon sat beside a bowl of scrambled eggs. "Good morning," she said. "I found the eggs in the chicken coop. I set up a proper nesting box so they should lay there regularly now." "Good morning," Preston replied, taking his seat. "You have been busy already." "I am an early riser," Tabitha said, pouring him coffee. "I hope you like your eggs scrambled. I can make them other ways if you prefer." "Scrambled is fine," Preston said, watching as she served him. The eggs were fluffy and perfectly seasoned, the bacon crispy. He ate with the same appreciation he had shown the night before, and Tabitha seemed to relax as she saw his enjoyment. After breakfast, Preston prepared to head into town for supplies. Tabitha handed him a carefully written list, along with a few suggestions for seeds if the general store had any left this late in the season. "I can get the garden going again," she explained. "We are late for most crops, but we can still plant some quick-growing things for fall harvest. And I would like to preserve what I can for winter." Preston took the list and headed into town, wondering what reception he would receive after hiring the woman everyone else had rejected. He need not have wondered long. As soon as he entered the general store, Mrs. Henderson and two of her friends stopped their conversation to stare at him. "Mr. Adams," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I hear you have taken on that Moore woman as your housekeeper." "I have," Preston said evenly, handing his list to Mr. Peterson behind the counter. "You do realize the woman is of questionable character," Mrs. Henderson continued. "Her husband died under suspicious circumstances, and she was run out of Dodge City for impropriety." Preston turned to face her directly. "What I realize, Mrs. Henderson, is that a woman needed honest work and I needed honest help. What I do not realize is how any of that is your business." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "Well, I never. I am simply trying to protect you from making a mistake that could damage your reputation." "My reputation will be just fine," Preston said. "And I would appreciate it if you kept your opinions about my household to yourself." He paid for his supplies, loaded them into his wagon, and headed back to the ranch. He was annoyed by the encounter but not surprised. Small towns ran on gossip, and a bachelor rancher hiring a supposedly scandalous widow was prime fodder for talk. When he returned to the ranch, he found that Tabitha had been even busier in his absence. The windows sparkled, the floors had been swept and scrubbed, and laundry hung on the line behind the house, snapping in the prairie wind. She emerged from the house as he pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you get everything?" she asked. "Most of it," Preston said, climbing down from the wagon. "Mr. Peterson had seeds, late in the season, but he said they should still grow." He hesitated, then added, "I should warn you, Mrs. Henderson is spreading talk about you in town, about us." Tabitha's face went carefully blank. "I expected as much. I am sorry if it causes you trouble." "It will not cause me any trouble I cannot handle," Preston said firmly. "I do not care for gossip, and I do not let it dictate my choices. You are doing excellent work here, and that is all that matters." For the second time, Tabitha's eyes grew bright. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." They unloaded the supplies together, and Preston found himself staying to help her organize the pantry rather than heading back out to work as he normally would. They worked well together, he noticed. She had a way of anticipating what needed doing next, and he found himself falling into a rhythm with her movements. Over the following weeks, Preston watched as the ranch house transformed under Tabitha's care. She worked from dawn to dusk, cleaning and organizing, cooking meals that were better than anything he had tasted outside of a fancy restaurant. She got the garden planted and coaxed late-season vegetables from the tired soil. She mended his clothes, darned his socks, and made the house shine. But more than that, Preston found himself looking forward to meal times, not just for the food but for the quiet companionship. Tabitha was well educated, he discovered. She had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and had come west with her husband who had dreams of making his fortune in the cattle trade. When he died, she had been left with nothing, and the rumors that she had somehow hastened his death had followed her from Dodge City to Abilene. It was not true, she told Preston one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of orange and gold. My husband was not a bad man, but he was weak. He could not handle the hardship of the West, and when he got sick, he gave up. I nursed him as best I could, but pneumonia is a cruel illness. When he died, his business partner claimed I must have done something wrong, must have wanted him dead to collect his insurance. But there was no insurance. There was nothing. Just debts I could not pay and rumors I could not escape. You do not need to explain, Preston said. I told you before I do not care about gossip, but you should know the truth, Tabitha insisted. You took a chance on me when no one else would. You deserve to know that I am not what they say. I know you are not, Preston said simply. I have seen the way you work, the care you put into everything you do. That tells me more about your character than any rumor could. The sunset was particularly beautiful that evening, and they sat in comfortable silence watching it. Preston realized he had not felt this content in years, perhaps ever. The ranch house felt like a home again, and having Tabitha there made him realize how lonely he had been. As summer turned to autumn, the rhythm of their life together settled into something comfortable and right. Preston worked the ranch, bringing in his cattle from the range and preparing for the coming winter. Tabitha tended the house and garden, preserving vegetables and making the house ready for cold weather. They took their meals together, sharing the details of their days, learning about each other in the slow, careful way of two people who had both been hurt. Preston noticed things about Tabitha that made his heart beat faster. The way she hummed while she worked, old songs from her childhood in Boston. The way her face lit up when she talked about books, which she dearly loved but rarely had access to. He brought her books from town, ignoring the raised eyebrows and whispered comments, just to see that joy in her eyes. Tabitha began to fill out as regular meals and lighter worry took their toll. The hollows in her cheeks filled in, her skin took on a healthier glow, and her eyes lost some of their haunted quality. She laughed more, smiled more, and Preston found himself doing things just to provoke those reactions. It was in October, with the leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods along the creek, that Preston realized he had fallen in love with her. They were working together to bring in the last of the garden before the first frost, her hands quick and efficient as she pulled carrots and beets. She looked up at him with dirt on her nose and a smile on her face, and his heart simply stopped. He loved her. He loved the way she made coffee in the morning, strong and dark just the way he liked it. He loved the way she fussed over his shirts, making sure they were properly mended. He loved the sound of her voice reading aloud in the evening, a habit she had started when she discovered his mother's small collection of books. He loved her strength, her resilience, her refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser person. But Preston had no idea if she felt the same way. She was kind to him, grateful certainly, but he could not tell if her feelings went deeper. He decided he needed to court her properly, to show her that his intentions were honorable and that he wanted more than just a housekeeper. He started small. He picked wildflowers from the prairie and left them in a jar on the kitchen table. He complimented her cooking more explicitly, telling her not just that the food was good but specifically what he appreciated about each meal. He offered to teach her to ride when she mentioned she had never learned properly, and spent patient afternoons helping her get comfortable in the saddle. Tabitha seemed surprised by the attention at first, then pleased, then something more that Preston could not quite define. She began taking extra care with her appearance, wearing her best dress on Sundays even though they did not go to church, pinning her hair in ways that framed her face beautifully. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the chill, Preston gathered his courage. "Tabitha," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight from the window. "What is it? When I hired you, I thought I just needed someone to cook and clean," Preston said slowly. "But somewhere along the way that changed. You have become more than my housekeeper. You have become my friend, my companion. You have made this house a home again, but more than that, you have made my life better in every way." Tabitha's breath caught, but she did not speak, just watched him with those luminous eyes. "What I am trying to say," Preston continued, "is that I have fallen in love with you. I know that complicates things, and if you do not feel the same way, we can pretend I never said anything. But I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that when I look at you, I do not see my housekeeper. I see the woman I want to spend my life with." Tabitha was quiet for a long moment, and Preston's heart sank. He had misread the situation, moved too fast, ruined everything. Then she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "You really mean that? You love me, with everything I have," Preston said simply. "Even though everyone in town thinks I am a murderer. Even though being with me will damage your reputation." "I do not care what anyone thinks," Preston said firmly. "I care about you, about us, about building a life together if you will have me." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I fell in love with you weeks ago," she admitted. "That first meal I cooked for you when you looked at me like I had given you something precious, something you had been missing. I started falling for you then, and I have not stopped. But I was afraid to hope that you might feel the same way." Preston stood and pulled her to her feet, taking her hands in his. "I feel the same way," he said. "I want to marry you, Tabitha. I want you to be my wife, not my housekeeper. I want to build a life with you, raise a family, grow old together on this land." "Yes," Tabitha whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Preston pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet, full of all the emotion they had been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I should ask you properly," Preston said. "I should get you a ring, should do this right." "You have done everything right," Tabitha said, touching his face with her hand. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You treated me with respect and kindness. You made me feel valued and safe. You have already given me more than I ever dreamed of having again." They sat back down on the porch, but this time Tabitha leaned against Preston's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. They talked late into the night, making plans for their future. They would marry quietly, Preston said, perhaps in town at the courthouse, or they could have the pastor come out to the ranch if she preferred. Tabitha said she did not care about the ceremony, only about the commitment. The next morning, Preston rode into Abilene to speak with the pastor and to buy a ring. He knew the whole town would be talking, but he did not care. Let them talk. He was going to marry the woman he loved. The pastor, Reverend Williams was more understanding than Preston had expected. He was an older man who had been in Abilene for many years and had seen his share of town gossip. "I have heard the talk about Miss Moore," he said, when Preston explained his purpose. "But I have also heard that she is a good woman who was treated poorly by circumstances. If you love her and want to marry her, I will perform the ceremony gladly." Preston bought a simple gold band at the jeweler's, the best he could afford, and headed back to the ranch with his heart lighter than it had been in years. That evening, he presented the ring to Tabitha over dinner. She cried when she saw it, happy tears this time, and tried it on. It fit perfectly. They set the wedding for the following Sunday, giving them a week to prepare. Tabitha was nervous about going into town, knowing the reception they would receive, but Preston assured her that he would be by her side every moment. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Tabitha made herself a new dress from fabric Preston bought in town, a simple but elegant design in deep blue that brought out her eyes. Preston had the ranch hand he occasionally hired, a man named Jack Foster, come help him with some repairs around the ranch so everything would be in good order. On Sunday morning, they drove into Abilene together in Preston's wagon. Tabitha wore her new dress and had pinned her hair up elegantly. Preston wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed by Tabitha's careful hands. He had never felt more nervous or more certain of anything in his life. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town. Preston had not advertised the wedding, but word had gotten around as it always did in small towns. When they arrived, they found the church mostly empty except for Reverend Williams and Jack Foster, who had agreed to stand as witness. But as Reverend Williams began the ceremony, the door opened and people began filing in. Mr. Peterson from the general store came in with his wife. Several of Preston's neighboring ranchers arrived with their families. Even Dr. Harrison, who had been the one to examine Tabitha's husband in Dodge City and declared the death natural, had made the journey to Abilene. Mrs. Henderson and her circle of friends did not attend, but Preston had not expected them to. What mattered was that enough good people had come to witness their marriage, to show their support despite the gossip. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Preston spoke his vows in a clear, strong voice, promising to love and cherish Tabitha for the rest of his life. Tabitha's voice trembled with emotion as she made the same promises, her eyes never leaving his face. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed his bride tenderly, and the small congregation applauded. They signed the marriage certificate with Jack and Dr. Harrison as witnesses, and then they were married. Outside the church, several people came up to congratulate them. Dr. Harrison shook Preston's hand firmly. "I have been feeling guilty about not speaking up more strongly about the circumstances of Mr. Moore's death," he said. "I knew he died of pneumonia, but I did not fight hard enough against the rumors. I am glad to see Mrs. Adams has found happiness." "Thank you for coming," Preston said, appreciating the gesture. They drove back to the ranch as husband and wife, Tabitha's hand clasped in Preston's. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, the prairie grass golden in the sunlight. When they reached the ranch house, Preston lifted Tabitha down from the wagon and, in a burst of romanticism that surprised them both, carried her across the threshold. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, two people who had been alone finding solace and joy in each other. Preston was gentle, mindful that Tabitha's first marriage had not been a happy one, and she responded with a passion that surprised and delighted them both. In the months that followed, they settled into married life with the same ease that had marked their earlier relationship. Tabitha continued to manage the house with skill and care, but now she did so as Preston's wife and partner. not his employee. They worked together on plans to expand the ranch, to improve the herd, to make the double even more successful. Winter came, and they weathered it together, spending long evenings by the fire reading aloud or simply talking. Preston taught Tabitha to play chess, and she proved to be a formidable opponent. Tabitha taught Preston to appreciate poetry, reading to him from a volume he had bought her for Christmas. Spring brought new life to the ranch and new joy to their marriage. In March, Tabitha told Preston she was expecting a child. He was overjoyed, already imagining teaching a son or daughter to ride and work the ranch. But spring also brought trouble. In April, a man arrived at the ranch claiming to be investigating Tabitha's husband's death. He was a private detective hired by her late husband's business partner, still convinced that Tabitha had somehow caused the death. Preston met the man on the porch, his face stern. "My wife had nothing to do with her first husband's death, and you are not welcome here." The detective, a thin man with cold eyes, shook his head. "I have been hired to investigate, and I intend to do my job. There are questions that need answering." "The only question is how fast you can get off my land," Preston said, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "I am not looking for trouble," the detective said, "but I will get to the truth." "The truth is that Edgar Moore died of pneumonia," a new voice said. They turned to see Dr. Harrison riding up the drive. "I examined him, I treated him, and I certified his death. There was no foul play." "Convenient that you are here," the detective said suspiciously. "I am here because I heard you were making trouble," Dr. Harrison said. "Word travels in these parts, and I am telling you now as a medical professional that there was nothing suspicious about Edgar Moore's death. He was a weak man who could not handle the rigors of frontier life. He got sick and he died. It happens." "His partner seems to think otherwise," the detective pressed. "His partner owed Edgar money and did not want to pay his debts," Dr. Harrison said bluntly. "He started the rumors to avoid his obligations. I have the documentation to prove it if you want to see it." The detective looked between Preston, Tabitha, who had come out onto the porch, and Dr. Harrison. He seemed to realize he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "I will report what I have found," he said finally. "Good day." He rode away, and Preston turned to Dr. Harrison with gratitude. "Thank you for coming. How did you know?" "Mr. Peterson sent word that a detective had been asking questions in town," Dr. Harrison explained. "I brought my medical records and a statement from the undertaker in Dodge City. I should have done this months ago, but I let laziness and cowardice stop me. I am glad I could help now." "We cannot thank you enough," Tabitha said, her voice thick with emotion. "No thanks needed," Dr. Harrison said kindly. "You are good people, and you deserve to be left in peace." The detective's investigation went nowhere. Dr. Harrison's documentation, combined with statements from others who had known Edgar Moore, made it clear that Tabitha had no role in her husband's death. The business partner was forced to pay Edgar's remaining debts, and the rumors finally began to die down. Summer came again, and Tabitha's pregnancy progressed. She remained active, still managing the house and garden with Preston's help. They prepared a nursery in the spare room, painting it cheerful yellow and filling it with a cradle Preston had made with his own hands. In August, on a hot afternoon when the cicadas sang in the cottonwoods, Tabitha went into labor. Preston rode frantically to town to fetch Dr. Harrison and Mrs. Peterson, who was known as the best midwife in the area. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as the sun set, Preston heard the first cry of his son. He was allowed into the room to find Tabitha exhausted but smiling, holding a red-faced, squalling infant. Preston approached slowly, almost afraid to touch something so small and precious. "Meet your son," Tabitha said softly. Preston looked down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers that waved in the air, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "He is perfect," he whispered. "What should we name him?" Tabitha asked. They had discussed names but had not decided. Preston thought of his father, a good man who had built the ranch from nothing. "Thomas," he said, "after your father, Thomas Moore Adams." Tabitha's eyes filled with tears. Her father had died when she was young, but she spoke of him often and lovingly. "Thomas," she repeated. "That is perfect." The baby Thomas was a healthy, loud child who quickly became the center of their world. Preston discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, walking the floor with a crying infant at midnight, changing diapers and marveling at every small milestone. Tabitha bloomed in motherhood, her love for their son evident in everything she did. But she also made sure to save time for Preston, for their relationship, understanding that a strong marriage was the foundation of a strong family. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Preston expanded his herd and hired more permanent help, building a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. The Double-A became known as one of the most successful ranches in the region, and Preston and Tabitha became respected members of the community. Even Mrs. Henderson eventually came around, though it took several years. She arrived at the ranch one day with a basket of preserves, claiming she wanted to welcome Tabitha properly to Abilene society. Tabitha, ever gracious, accepted the gesture for what it was, an apology, however belated. 2 years after Thomas was born, Tabitha gave Preston a daughter. They named her Margaret after Preston's mother, and she had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn determination. Thomas was an excellent big brother, protective and gentle with his baby sister. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. The ranch continued to grow, and so did their family. Another son, named Preston Jr. but called PJ, was born 3 years after Margaret, and then a second daughter, Sarah, completed their family 2 years after that. The ranch house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the sounds of children playing, of laughter and arguments, and the thousand small noises that make a house a home. Tabitha ruled over it all with competence and love, while Preston worked the land and taught his children the value of hard work and integrity. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston and Tabitha stood on the porch where he had first told her he loved her. The children were asleep inside, worn out from a day of celebration. The prairie stretched out before them, peaceful under the stars. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked, taking Tabitha's hand. "Marrying me, staying here instead of going back east where life might have been easier?" Tabitha looked at him with those green eyes that still made his heart beat faster. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me a life when I thought I had none. You gave me love when I thought I was unlovable. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. How could I regret any of that?" "I am the one who should be grateful," Preston said. "That first meal you made, it did not just make me forget every rule I had set about keeping distance. It made me realize what I had been missing. It made me want more than just survival. It made me want a life, a real life, and I found that with you." "We found it together," Tabitha corrected, leaning against his shoulder the way she had that first night he told her he loved her. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The ranch, the children, the life they had created, it was more than either of them had dreamed possible that day in Abilene, when a desperate woman and a lonely rancher had taken a chance on each other. Inside the house, baby Sarah began to cry, and Margaret's voice called for her mother. Tabitha smiled and squeezed Preston's hand before heading inside. Preston followed, thinking as he always did that he was the luckiest man alive. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and challenges but also joys. Thomas grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of the land and his mother's quick mind. He took over more and more of the ranch work as Preston's hair began to gray, learning the business from the ground up. Margaret became a teacher, much like her maternal grandfather, opening a small school on the ranch property to educate not only her younger siblings, but also the children of the ranch hands and neighboring families. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's sense of justice, and she was beloved by her students. PJ discovered he had a talent for working with horses, and he developed a breeding program that brought the double additional income and renown. His horses were known throughout Kansas and beyond for their strength, intelligence, and gentle temperament. Sarah, the baby, surprised everyone by becoming interested in medicine. Dr. Harrison, now quite elderly, took her under his wing and taught her what he could. She eventually went east to study properly, returning with a medical degree and opening a practice in Abilene, the first female doctor in the region. Preston and Tabitha watched their children grow and flourish with pride and joy. They had given their children not just a home but a legacy, a place of safety and love from which to launch into the world. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration that brought together friends and neighbors from all over the region. The ranch house was filled with people, with laughter and music and good food. Preston looked around at the gathering and marveled at how far they had come from that day when he had hired a housekeeper no one else would touch. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home, Preston found Tabitha in the kitchen, overseeing the cleanup. He took the dish towel from her hands and pulled her into his arms. "Dance with me," he said. "There is no music," Tabitha protested, but she was smiling. "We do not need music," Preston said, and he waltzed her around the kitchen floor, both of them laughing like young people instead of the 50-something-year-old couple they were. Their children, watching from the doorway, smiled at each other. They had grown up seeing their parents' love for each other, the way they worked together, supported each other, and never took each other for granted. It had shaped them all, given them a model of what a good marriage could be. As Preston and Tabitha swayed together in the kitchen of the house that had seen so much life, so much love, Preston thought back to that first meal Tabitha had made for him. The stew that had been so good had made him forget every rule he had set for himself about keeping distance and maintaining propriety. He had thought he was just hiring a housekeeper. Instead, he had found his soulmate, his partner, the mother of his children, and the love of his life. All because he had been willing to look past gossip and give a desperate woman a chance. All because she had the skill and the heart to turn a house into a home with a single meal. "I love you," he whispered into her hair as they danced. "I love you too," Tabitha whispered back. Always and forever. The years continued their steady march. Preston and Tabitha grew old together, their hair turning white, their steps slower but their love as strong as ever. They became grandparents, delighting in the next generation of Adams' children. Thomas married a neighboring rancher's daughter and gave them 3 grandsons. Margaret married a lawyer from Topeka and had twin daughters. PJ married a woman who shared his love of horses and had 2 sons and a daughter. Sarah married a fellow doctor she met in medical school and had 1 son. The ranch house was often filled with grandchildren, running and playing just as their parents had done. Preston built a swing in the old cottonwood by the creek, the same tree where he and Tabitha had often sat during their courtship. He pushed grandchildren on that swing, telling them stories about the old days, about how the West used to be. Tabitha taught her granddaughters to cook, passing on the skills that had changed the course of her life. She taught them her recipes, but more importantly, she taught them that food prepared with love and care was more than just sustenance. It was a way of showing affection, of building family, of creating home. On a crisp autumn day, 40 years after Preston had first hired Tabitha, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the chill. They were in their late 60s now, still healthy but feeling their years. The ranch was run by Thomas now, with help from his brothers. Preston and Tabitha had officially retired, though Preston still liked to ride out and check on things most days. "You remember the first time we sat here together?" Tabitha asked, her hand in Preston's. "I remember every moment we have spent together," Preston said. "But yes, I remember that evening particularly well. I told you I loved you and you said you loved me too. Best evening of my life up to that point." "Only up to that point," Tabitha teased. "Well, our wedding night was pretty good," Preston said with a grin. "And the births of our children. And about 1,000 other moments we have shared." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie they both loved. The grass was golden in the autumn light, and a cool breeze carried the scent of coming winter. "Preston," Tabitha said softly, "I want you to know that I have been happier these 40 years than I ever thought possible. You saved my life that day in Abilene, not just by giving me work but by seeing me, the real me, past all the rumors and gossip. You gave me a chance to prove myself, and then you gave me your heart. I could not have asked for more." Preston squeezed her hand gently. "You saved me too," he said. "I was lonely and lost, just going through the motions of living. You brought life and love and purpose back into my world. Everything good in my life came from that decision to hire you, to take a chance on a woman everyone else had given up on." "We took a chance on each other," Tabitha said. "And look what we built." They looked out at the ranch, at the house filled with memories, at the land they had worked and loved for 4 decades. They thought of their children and grandchildren, the legacy they would leave behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Preston and Tabitha remained on the porch, holding hands, grateful for every moment they had been given together. The seasons continued to turn, bringing more years of happiness. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The party was held at the ranch, of course, and people came from all over Kansas and beyond to celebrate with them. Preston was 78 and Tabitha 77 when Preston finally hung up his hat for good. His body, worn from decades of hard ranch work, could no longer do what his mind wanted it to do. But he did not mind. He had lived a full life, had built something lasting, and he was ready to rest. He spent his final years sitting on the porch with Tabitha, watching their family continue the work they had started. He read books, played with his great-grandchildren, and every evening he thanked God for the woman sitting beside him. Tabitha remained active longer, her smaller frame holding up better to the passage of time. She still cooked for family gatherings, still tended a small garden, still kept the house as neat and organized as she had when she first arrived all those decades ago. Preston passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night, Tabitha beside him as she had been for 53 years. She held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she was grateful that he had gone gently, without pain or struggle. She lived 3 more years without him, cared for lovingly by her children. She remained sharp and engaged until the end, telling stories about the old days, about the Wild West as it used to be, about the cowboy who had given her a chance when no one else would. On a spring morning in 1935, with the scent of flowers drifting through the window and her children gathered around her bed, Tabitha closed her eyes for the last time. Her final words were about Preston, about the love they had shared, about the beautiful life they had built together. They buried her beside Preston on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the shade of a cottonwood tree. The headstone was simple, listing their names and dates, but it also bore an inscription chosen by their children. Together they built a legacy of love. The ranch continued under the care of the Adams family, passing from generation to generation. The house that Preston built and Tabitha made into a home still stands, now preserved as a historical landmark. Visitors can tour the rooms where a love story began with a simple meal, where a family was raised, where two people who should never have found each other created something beautiful that lasted beyond their lifetimes. The story of Preston and Tabitha Adams became a local legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. The cowboy who hired a housekeeper no one would touch, and the first meal that made him forget every rule he had set for himself. A simple story of two people who took a chance on each other and found not just love but a lifetime of happiness. Their descendants still live in Kansas, many still working the land, all carrying forward the legacy of hard work, integrity, and love that Preston and Tabitha established. The Double A Ranch, though much changed from the days when Preston first inherited it, still operates, a testament to the vision of a young cowboy and the woman who became his partner in every sense of the word. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the sunset paints the prairie gold and the wind whispers through the grass, those who know the story say you can almost see them, Preston and Tabitha, sitting on that porch together, holding hands and watching the land they loved, together for all eternity just as they were in life. The meal that started it all, that simple stew made from potatoes and salt pork and vegetables pulled from a neglected garden, became famous in its own right. Tabitha had written down the recipe, and it was passed through the family, made at every gathering, a reminder of where they all came from. The recipe card, yellowed with age and stained from use, was eventually framed and hung in the ranch house kitchen, a memorial to the meal that changed everything. Visitors to the ranch museum often asked about the recipe, and copies were made available, though the family always said it never tasted quite the same when made by other hands. The secret ingredient, they said, was not anything you could measure or write down. It was love, care, and the hope of a woman who had been given a second chance and was determined to make the most of it. The love story of Preston and Tabitha Adams stood as proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, that taking a chance on someone can change not just their life but your own, and that love, real love, can overcome any obstacle, outlast any gossip, and build something that endures long after we are gone. Their story reminded people that everyone deserves a second chance, that snap judgments based on rumors can cause real harm, and that sometimes the person everyone else rejects is exactly the person you need. It reminded people that love is not always convenient or expected, that it does not always follow the rules society sets, but that when it is real and true, it is worth fighting for. Preston and Tabitha's marriage had not been perfect. They had their disagreements, their difficult moments, their times of struggle. But they faced everything together with mutual respect and unwavering commitment. They built their relationship on a foundation of friendship and trust, and that foundation held strong through 5 decades of marriage and beyond. Their children often reflected on how lucky they were to have been raised by parents who genuinely loved each other, who worked as partners, who showed through their daily actions what commitment and respect looked like. That example shaped the way each of them approached their own marriages and families, creating a ripple effect that extended through generations. The town of Abilene, Kansas, changed dramatically over the years. The Wild West became the settled Midwest. Cattle drives ended, replaced by railroads and trucks. The dirt streets were paved, electricity came, then telephones, then television. But through all the changes, the story of Preston and Tabitha remained, a touchstone connecting the present to the past. The church where they married still stood, though it had been renovated several times. The general store where Preston had posted his original advertisement for a housekeeper was long gone, replaced by modern buildings. But the memories remained, kept alive by those who believed that some stories were too important to forget. As the 20th century progressed, and then gave way to the 21st, the Adams family continued to tell the story of their ancestors, making sure each new generation knew where they came from. They told of a time when the West was wild and dangerous, when survival was not guaranteed, when people had to be tough to make it. But more than that, they told of love that transcended circumstances, of courage in the face of adversity, of the power of giving someone a chance. They told of a meal that changed two lives, bringing together two lonely people and creating a family that would span generations. The legacy of Preston and Tabitha Adams was not just in the land they worked or the ranch they built. It was in the values they instilled, the love they shared, and the example they set. It was in every marriage in their family that lasted, in every child who was raised with love and care, in every person who chose to see beyond surface judgments to the person beneath. In the end, their story was simple. A cowboy needed a housekeeper, a woman needed a chance, and a single meal opened both their hearts to the possibility of love. From that simple beginning grew a love story that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that would endure for generations. And that, perhaps, is the greatest testament to their love. Not the years they shared, though those were many, and not the children they raised, though those were successful and happy, but the fact that their story continued to inspire, to give hope, and to remind people that love, real love, can be found in the most unexpected places and can overcome any obstacle. Preston and Tabitha Adams lived, loved, and left the world better than they found it. What more could anyone ask from a life well lived? Their story, born in the dust and heat of a Kansas summer in 1879, proved that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning, but from moments of courage when we choose to follow our hearts instead of the rules, when we choose to see people as they are rather than as gossip paints them, and when we choose love over fear. The first meal Tabitha made for Preston was more than just food. It was a promise, a hope, a reaching out from one lonely soul to another. And Preston's acceptance of that meal, his appreciation of the care and skill that went into it, was his own reaching back, his own acknowledgement that he saw her, valued her, and was willing to take a chance. From that moment forward, their lives were intertwined, two threads woven together to create something beautiful and strong. They faced the world together, built a life together, and in doing so, proved that love is not about finding a perfect person, but about choosing to build something perfect together, day by day, meal by meal, moment by moment. Their story ended as all stories must, but the love they shared, the family they created, and the example they set continued on, passed down through the generations like a precious inheritance. And in that way, Preston and Tabitha Adams achieved a kind of immortality, living on in the hearts and minds of those who came after them, inspiring new love stories with each retelling of their own. The cowboy who hired a housekeeper no one would touch found not just help for his household but a partner for his heart. The woman who made a meal that made him forget every rule found not just employment but a home, a family, and a love that would sustain her through all the days of her life. Together, they proved that sometimes the most important rules are the ones we are brave enough to break, and that the greatest rewards come when we are willing to take a chance on love.